Hi, Jason.
Hey, Will, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Not bad.
Hello to everyone out there. I'm Will Wilkinson, and I'm with Jason Brennan. Jason, what is your very exalted title?
I'm a assistant professor of strategy, economics, ethics, and public policy at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University.
That is a
Whew,
mouthful.
it takes a lot. It takes a long time to say that.
Yeah.
My business card's this big.
Yeah. Do you just get them printed out on pieces of plywood?
That's right.
Well, we're here today to talk about Jason's new book, Why Not Capitalism, which is the publisher is what, Routledge?
Yes, Rutledge.
And the publication date is
Was it like officially June 11th, 2014? Something
June
like
11th, so it's out now.
Yeah, that's right.
It's available at fine book retailers everywhere. I would hold up a picture of the cover, but I only had a PDF to read. The cover it has a white background and a profusion of red roses.
Mm-hmm.
It's taking off of G.A. Cohen's book Why Not Socialism, which has a single red rose.
Yeah, more and better.
More and better. But why not more red roses?
Yeah, not just more roses and better roses. That's right. I mean, why stop at just more?
That's right. So even the cover of the book is a sort of response to Cohen. This book is kind of an extended rebuttal to G.A. Cohen's Why Not Socialism. And I'll let you tell us about the structure of the argument. So Cohen argues for socialism using a sort of deceptively simple thought experiment. And why don't you run us through it?
Sure. Yeah, and on that point too, it's Cohen I think is capturing an idea that most people have. The idea is that if we were better than we are, if we were the way that we all think we ought to be, that we kind of have in our religions and our various moral views of what a good person is, we would be socialist. And we have markets and capitalism because we're kind of all selfish and mean and not willing to do what it takes to help each other. And to kind of get to that argument, he just has this thought experiment about camping. He says, imagine that you and your friends go together on a camping trip. You all have the common goal of everybody having a good time. And suppose the camping trip runs as well as a camping trip could run. He thinks you'd bring your private property and your stuff to the trip, but when you get there with your friends, you would treat everything that's there as kind of a common bounty, and you would equally share the tasks to make sure that no one is sort of having a worse time than anyone else and divvying up the labor that has to be done. You'd try to make sure that everybody's having an equally good time. Everyone gets kind of common access to everything. And it sounds wonderful. It sounds like a really good camping trip. And then he says, now imagine that the camping trip runs the way that the capitalism runs. It starts becoming a capitalist camping trip rather than the previous version that was a socialist camping trip. So he says, suppose I'm on the trip and I start saying things like, hey guys, I'm really good at catching fish and I'm willing to catch fish for everybody, but only if I get out of having to dig latrines. I don't want to do that. Mm-hmm. And then suppose you, Will, you're like, well, my friend or my grandfather used to camp here, and he told me about a pond that he stocked with fish, and I'm willing to go catch some of these fish and tell you guys where the pond is, but only if I eat more than the rest of you. And then when we have dinner, you sit there and gloat, ha, I'm higher status, I have more food. And suppose there's another person.
So much halibut.
Yeah, right. So much halibut. Suppose Carrie's with us, and she has special knowledge of how to crack nuts, and she's willing to share that knowledge so that we have more nuts to eat. But again, only if she gets some sort of special privileges. We all get into this kind of status-seeking competition, and we all selfishly try to we use skills and our talents, but only if we get selfish benefits to do it. We're not willing to do it for the common good or just because we like each other anymore. And Cohen says, if you're in a camping trip like that, it would stink. And he's right. It would be a terrible camping trip. So he's like, clearly the socialist version of the camping trip is better than the capitalist version of the camping trip. So then the extension of the argument is to say something like, well, what if we could make the whole world like the socialist camping trip? Leave aside right now the question of whether we can. What if we could? Wouldn't that be desirable? Wouldn't that be clearly better than the way things are? The way the world is much more like the capitalist version of the camping trip. It should be like the socialist version if we could only get there. He says, and whether it's desirable or not, he says, has nothing to do about whether it's feasible. And I think that's obvious. Like, I would really love to have the Force from Star Wars. That's not feasible. There's a book called the Beyond Star Trek: The Physics of Sci-Fi by Lawrence Krauss. It's not feasible. It won't ever happen. But I'd love to have the Force. I'd love to be able to cure AIDS by snapping my fingers. That's clearly not feasible. So whether
maybe
something
you
is
just did it.
I hope so. We'll find out after the show, I guess. So whether something is desirable or not has nothing to do with whether it's feasible. And he says, even from a moral point of view, like, this society is the way things should be. It doesn't matter that it might not be, that we're not able to get there. But then even on that point, he says, why aren't we able to be socialist? It's because people aren't very nice. They could do what morality requires. They just won't because they're jerks.
Right.
If I say something like, as a parallel, here's McMahon's theory of just war. If people followed McMahon's theory of just war, there'd be no war, probably, except in very exceptional circumstances. There wouldn't be any war. Now, the theory is eminently feasible. All it requires is that people follow a bunch of simple rules that they could follow. It's just that they won't because they're jerks. We could start living that theory perfectly tomorrow. It would be easy as pie to do it. It's just given that people are evil, they won't.
Right.
So Cohen's going to say the same thing about like capitalism and socialism. We could start being socialists tomorrow. It's just we're not going to, and the reason is because everyone who's watching this at home is scum. Yeah.
Well, I'll admit that it's been a while now, but I don't know, probably when I was, maybe 18 years old, I think I bought that argument. I think like that's what I thought. I had a certain kind of Christian socialism where if we were really Christian and we really cared about the least among us, we would be communists. We would, that's an idea with a venerable American lineage. It's part of my heritage too. I grew up a kind of Mormon, and Mormons started out as a communist experiment, which may seem strange given how capitalistic Mormons are. One of the decisive moments was the prophet getting tarred and feathered in part for wanting to communalize some private property. But that's just because they were jerks, right? Yeah, they were just like if they would have known what was really good, if they would have had God in their hearts, they would have gone along with the full on communal scheme. And so that was persuasive to me. And I think that's really persuasive to a lot of people. And if you've ever taught philosophy to undergraduates, it's you hear it a lot. That we would do it, but we're just not good enough.
Right. Yeah, and I mean a lot of the arguments that people use, like, well, we can't have socialism because people will free ride off of one another. That's a good point. They will. Why do they do that? Well, because of mutual distrust and diffidence, and because people are kind of tempted by the possibility of taking advantage of one another's. Ideally perfect people are not tempted to take advantage of one another. They're not tempted to exploit one another or free ride. And if they know they're living among perfect people, they know that they can trust other people not to do that. And so the kinds of problems you see in real life communism don't appear. They only happen because we are morally bad, according to basically everyone's view of what's morally bad.
Yeah. So you in this book have you kind of run through that argument, but then you say, well, it's maybe not as persuasive as it might be, and it turns because like the argument kind of turns on what you think the alternatives are.
Right.
So if we were morally perfect, we'd be socialist. Everyone would hold everything in common. We're capitalist because we are fearful. We're selfish. But you want to argue, well, like if you can imagine a socialist camping trip where people have perfect motivations, why can't you imagine a capitalist, capitalist society where people have perfect motivations as well, and see how those stack up?
Yeah, that's right. I recognize like what the basic error was in Cohen's book a couple years ago before I even thought of this idea. And that was that all he's doing is he's comparing an imaginary idealized society to real life capitalism. And he says the idealized socialist society is clearly better than realistic capitalism, so therefore socialism is better than capitalism. And I went, no, because you're comparing ideal to real. You might be better that the idealized version of one system is better than the realistic version of another, but we want to know, is that idealistic version of one system better than the idealized version of another? That same system, of a different system, sorry. So you have to compare ideal capitalism and ideal socialism. You can't just compare ideal to real. So I was actually literally watching the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse TV show on Disney Junior with my kids, and I was watching it, and Clarabelle Cow owned something called a Moo Muffin Factory and a Moo Mart. And then I started watching, and then like later, as it ended, they had this like little thing called Minnie's Boutique, and Minnie Mouse in the show is a CGI animated cartoon.
B-O-W.
Yes, that's right. It's a boutique. It makes bows, right?
Yeah.
So Minnie Mouse is a hardcore capitalist. She owns a bow factory. She owns the means of production, and then she has people who might be working for her. I'm not sure if they're employed by her or not, or if they're cooperative, if it's cooperatively owned or not. I don't know. But she nevertheless sells things to movie stars and others, and she has a bow making factory. And I realize I'm watching this show, and it's presenting a utopian capitalist society. All of the moral flaws that exist on the show are there simply to teach lessons to toddlers, and they could easily be written out. They're not essential to the show, or they're there for laughs. Like, Donald Duck is a little bit too temperamental, but he doesn't have to be. It's not because they're capitalists. It's just funny to make
He's a little
like
hot-blooded, that Donald.
A little bit, yeah. That's right. So other than that, everyone's like morally flawless. They're as good as the people in Cohen's camping trip, and they're capitalist. But it makes sense that they're capitalist. I was watching, I can see why they're capitalist. Why, even though they're so good, they could do what Cohen wants them to do. They get additional value out of having private property. And so I realized this leads us to a moral argument for capitalism. So Cohen's basically saying that justice is what happens in a world in which everybody's perfect. Justice is what happens in a world in which everyone does the right thing for the right reason. And in that world, he thinks we wouldn't have any need for private property. Most of the arguments that economists and sociologists or others institutional political scientists will come up with for us having private property rely upon flaws in human nature and say that private property is a useful response to that. What the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse shows us is that there are additional reasons to have private property, even if none of those problems were there. Even if there were no flaws in human nature, there are still reasons to have it.
So your chapter where this is actually a really funny book of political philosophy. So this is chapter that runs through the Mickey's Playhouse Village. Well, one, just choosing that as the counterpoint to Cohen's camping trip, rhetorically is a pretty damning criticism. That you're like, what's a good parallel to this is an animated children's show. It's literally a cartoon, right? And maybe I'll get back to this when we talk a little bit about idealization, because idealization is a kind of, mental cartooning where you're abstracting and simplifying into something that's a lot simpler in some ways than real life. But just to and I'm sure it would get it. Just I'm imagining what our friends at Crooked Timber or something, feel about this, of course Disney is going to produce this, pro-capitalist propaganda. So there's a lot of things that are kind of funny about it.
Yeah, that's right. Speaking of Crooked Timber, after I wrote this, I realized I've produced a left-wing socialist morality defense of capitalism. So I now consider it, I'm the hardcore left. To my right are people like Jerry Cohen and people like Crooked Timber people, and then to their right are your average libertarian. So
they're the people who think we're not good enough to be capitalist.
Yeah, now I'm like I'm the real hardcore leftist now. But just turns out that leftism leads to utopian capitalism.
Yeah. So the argument is funny too, because you make the same. Your first chapter is a very self-conscious parody where you're parroting the structure and even the tone of Cohen's argument, and when you in this chapter, when you characterize socialism, you characterize it incredibly uncharitably, so that it is shown to exemplify the worst human motives. And so you're comparing Mickey Mouse's, Playhouse Village with the Khmer Rouge and
right.
and the liquidation of the kulaks
That's right.
Which obviously is unfair, right? Like you can't compare ideal capitalism with and it's what a socialist will always tell you. Well, it's never really been tried. I mean, like what we have in mind is something that comes out of a certain kind of purity of motives that hasn't, for whatever reason, been realized.
Yeah, that's right. I wanted to parallel this structure and that Cohen uses. So he has this realistic account, or his idealized account of socialism, and that's real socialism. And then he compares that to what it takes to be a realistic description of capitalism. I just want to do the same thing. So I describe the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse village as it is in the show. There's both a communal ends and private ends. People work together and they also do things apart. They share, they're benevolent, they live under principles of community and mutual respect. They own things and they trade. They don't trade because they're selfish and don't care about one another, but they trade because they want to be the kind of people that produce value for others. And as I say, like, it actually means something for Minnie Mouse to be able to produce bows that you buy for your own sake. She doesn't want you to buy her bows as a favor to her. She wants you it's part of her meaning in life that she can create something so valuable that other people are willing to give up something to get it because they think it's a good quality
thing. I would look great in that bow.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. So it's an aesthetic thing for her. It's a desire to produce something of genuine quality, and trade illustrates that. And they're glad to be reciprocating through the process of trade. They come together. There's crisis, like if something called Gooey Goo accidentally turns all the characters into babies, Goofy will work hard to save them. Or if there's a baby dragon, there's usually baby things involved.
Does Goofy not get turned into a baby?
No, he doesn't get turned into a baby. He's the one that's
interesting. He's like the kryptonite of Gooey Goo.
I guess, yeah. He just missed him. But in another show, he does, however, have 5 copies made of him, and others have to rescue him from that. If a baby dragon is missing, they all come together and save the dragon and make sure it gets back to its mommy and so on. They do the right things, and they're always
people get hiccups that won't go away right before a show.
Balls that won't stop bouncing.
Balls that won't stop bouncing, yeah.
Right. And whatever the crisis is, they come together to solve it, and they make use of their different talents. And it's wonderful. There's nothing I can see there that a socialist would have a complaint about. They seem to be exemplifying every Christian virtue. They seem to be exemplifying all of the virtues of benevolence and beneficence and mutual respect and everything else. I don't think anyone could have a moral complaint about that. Then when I describe the sort of socialist version, I want it to be like realistic socialism. If Cohen's using realistic capitalism, I'll use realistic socialism. Realistic socialism has been a moral disaster. It's just people murdering each other. So I had described Donald creating gulags and Goofy murdering people and Minnie creating 5-year plans that lead to massive wealth inequality, like massive poverty and so on. And
did your publishers have any worries about Disney being annoyed at your book?
I had worries about that, and I asked them. I said, like, are we going to get in trouble for using Disney? And they're like, no, that's fair use. Don't worry about it.
Okay. I was like Mickey, the paranoid dictator.
That's right.
This might not be like what they're hoping to.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, though, it's just at the end of the day, I'm extolling the virtues of Disney. I'm basically saying that the writers of the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse have solved this perennial. There's been a debate about capitalism versus socialism for a few hundred years, and then it's clear that in the real world, capitalism won that debate. With real dirty people who are evil, capitalism wins. We should have that instead. But then socialists have retreated to what they think is the moral high ground, and now capitalists get to have that too, thanks to the writers of the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse TV show. Mm-hmm. So I'm basically saying, like, you guys have solved a debate. I'm just pointing out that you've done that.
Great benefactors
I think they're
of
probably
humanity.
going to be okay with that. I hope. Yeah. So I actually say in the chapter on this, I go, look, I'm parodying Cohen. I'm sometimes like just taking paragraphs of his and moving some words around to show that a lot of the stuff he says about capitalism works equally well or better for socialism. I'm parodying the structure, the tone, and other things. I say to readers, if you're a socialist, you're probably going to think that what I'm saying is kind of bogus. And you're right. There's a sense in which the argument I'm making is bogus, but if it's bogus in the way that Cohen's argument is bogus. But what I want to say is that when you think about what goes wrong with the moves that I'm making and what goes wrong with the moves that he's making, you put those together, what emerges is actually a genuinely good argument for why, if people were perfect, they would be capitalists rather than predominantly socialist.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit more about that in a second, about the extra advantages of a system of private property and trade and commerce in a minute. But before that, let's talk a little bit about idealization. and the kind of dialectic of this book that's kind of requiring you to argue ideal versus ideal. So, as you said, a lot of pro-capitalist philosophers, economists tend to argue for the kind of liberal free market on non-ideal terms. They like social. It's preferable to socialism. Capitalism is preferable to socialism because socialism won't work,
right,
for one reason or another. And there's a strong tendency to think that our limitations as human beings, morally and cognitively, aren't sort of contingent features of us, but are just that our theorizing should take account of those. And that prevents a lot of libertarian theorists from really directly rebutting, arguments like Cohen's that say, like, if we were morally perfect, we'd be socialist. A lot of people, and I'm one of them, find it hard to understand what it means to talk about if we were morally perfect. And so I just wanted you to say a little bit more about that and why for you this is, because like for me reading your book I was like, oh, this is like really clever as a debate move, right? Like it's just like, okay, I see the point of conceding Cohen's premises about the credibility of ideal theory and saying, okay, I'm gonna see the ways you idealize human nature. I'll adopt all of those idealizations, and I'll show you that even on your own assumptions, that you don't get the answer that you wanted. Right. But you don't think that you're just granting premises for the sake of argument. You think this is actually the right way to argue about political philosophy.
Yeah, in a sense, I think it's good to do both ideal and non-ideal theory. So let's start with the rhetorical point. Here's one way of thinking about it. Either Cohen has this methodological critique of political philosophy. He says all the other political philosophers like John Rawls and Robert Nozick and anyone else that you might be reading concede too much to human nature. Not just, he says, we should concede the fact that people have cognitive limits. So there's something called the calculation problem of socialism. He concedes that. He accepts that that's probably true. He says we can't ask people to do more than they're physically capable or mentally capable of doing, but we shouldn't take human motivations to be fixed. If people have bad motivations, that doesn't mean that morality gets dumbed down for that. And one example of that might be something like, John Rawls says we should, or on Cohen's interpretation, John Rawls says we should allow income inequality because that motivates people to work harder and then we'll all have more. And Cohen says, well, if we were all perfectly just and cared about one another, we wouldn't have to be bribed to work harder. So we wouldn't have income inequality. So from a rhetorical standpoint, we can think of it this way. Either ideal theory is silly or it's not. If it is silly, then Cohen's argument doesn't work, and I beat Cohen on the socialist grounds on the basis of other things I've written, like the book with David Schmitz, The Brief History of Liberty, on institutional grounds of this is what works best. If it's not silly though, if ideal theory is a good thing, then you have to respond to it in its own terms, and then I beat Cohen on his terms. So I think of it as capitalism wins regardless of whether you do ideal theory or non-ideal theory. Whereas before this book was written, capitalism was clearly winning on the non-ideal theory part, but it had kind of conceded ideal theory, that it wouldn't win on ideal theory. And all the capitalists were doing, like my mentor David Schmitz and Jerry Gauss and other kinds of people in philosophy who write about this, is to say ideal theory is bogus. So now it's kind of like you can concede everything and you still get your side wins. So from a rhetorical standpoint, it's the thing to do. But I actually think that Cohen's onto something. Cohen says, morality doesn't get dumbed down because of people's bad motivation. So an example that I give in the book is, suppose there's a person who just really likes raping people and he really, really wants to do it. He doesn't have to. He just really wants to. And if you say to him, well, morality forbids rape, he says, no, you don't understand. I think that's way too demanding of a moral principle because it's the thing I most want to do. Most of us aren't going to say, oh, well, I guess it's fine. You can rape people if that's what you want. We'd say, you're just a horrible person. You're still not permitted to rape. If you take Jeff McMahon's just war theory, his book Killing in War, which is correct as far as I'm concerned. it's clear that the world is not going to follow what's in there because people are bad. But it doesn't mean that they're not bad. It doesn't mean we dumb down theories of just war to accommodate the fact that people are violent or that they'll use war in order to advance their own interest at the expense of other people. It's just people don't do what's right. So I think that when it comes to negative obligations, like don't do this, most people, including basically all libertarians, will accept this. They'll say the fact that people want to prey upon one another doesn't mean that there's no duty not to prey upon one another. But for some reason, when you bring in positive obligations, like obligations to promote social justice or to be beneficent or so on, or to help one another, many people, both libertarians and otherwise, will say, oh, the fact that you don't want to at some point counts as a reason why you don't have to. Finally, here's one other point about this. Even if you don't accept even if you think, so basically Cohen's saying, I accept that can't implies that you don't have to. Like if you can't do something, you don't have to. But don't confuse I'm not willing to with I can't. You could do it, you just won't because you're mean. But you could. It's easy. Yeah. You just aren't going to. It would be easy for you to do the right thing. You could do it right now. You just won't. And it's because you're not very nice. Yeah. But here's another thing about this. It's like we don't really know what the limits are of what we can do. And I have a metaphor for this or analogy to this in the book. I say, imagine you went back in time and found like some Homo sapien tribe, like, tribes like from 30,000 years ago, and started talking to them about like they're warring with one another and killing one another and living in small family clans. And you said, instead of you guys living together in small family clans and warring against one another, what if you lived like this? And you describe to them modern day Switzerland. They would go, that's crazy. That's incompatible with human nature. They wouldn't have the word utopian, but that's way too utopian. There's no way we could ever live like that. But clearly they'd be wrong, right? You know better. I don't know if we really know for sure how well we can live in the future, especially when you take into account that maybe 100 years from now or even sooner, we'll be able to genetically engineer people to be much more trustworthy and altruistic than they in fact are. It's possible that we're going to technologically create Mickey Mouse type people.
Now, I wonder if when you make that argument, when I read it in the book that if we go back to some hunter gatherers and present to them the possibility of contemporary Switzerland, that actually was that to me is a skeptical argument. That I don't think there's any particular reason to believe that we're especially morally evolved. That you can see human nature at this point as either, early or late in its development. And it's maybe we're early, maybe we're not that far along from hunter-gatherers. If you imagine what those hunter-gatherers, if they were doing their version of ideal theory, what they would have thought of as a utopia is probably going to be something that we would find maybe not terribly ambitious or just absolutely puzzling. And that raises the question of like why, when we're doing utopian theorizing, why we think that has really any, authority. Isn't it in some ways? And this is part of the argument that maybe Rawls is making against someone like Cohen, is that our moral sensibility is endogenous to institutional and social structure. So our sense of justice, our moral sense, is largely determined by the conditions under which we're brought up, the institutions that we inhabit as we develop, psychologically and morally, and that our ability to sort of abstract away from our contingent capacities is still going to carry with it all of this sort of conditioning by current institutions. And so even when you're ideal theorizing, you only get a couple steps away from the status quo. It's a way of tweaking the status quo so that you can see a direction of possible improvement. But it's not a way of actually identifying moral truth.
Yeah, that might be the case. Cohen doesn't accept almost anything from Rawls about any of these presuppositions. And, for arguing with him, I'm going to just kind of take his side, like in the debate. But I think if Cohen wanted to be kind of really charitable about this, he would say, look, from where we stand, like as a matter of fact, about our psychology, we are conditioned by institutions, and that will change what we're willing to do and what we can trust other people to do. And it might also constrain where we're able to go. And Cohen actually says this quite frequently. It might be that we're stuck doing this rather than this other thing, that we're in an institutional mechanism from which we could never get to the place we should be, even though we can recognize that this place is better.
The runway's not long enough, so we'll never get takeoff velocity.
That's right. So, but I think even Cohen would say, he's saying, when I think this is what morality requires, I recognize I could be wrong about that. In the same way that I recognize that I could be wrong, that you're actually Will Wilkinson, you could be an imposter, right?
We'll never know.
We'll never know, right? Yeah. There could be wrong about all these things. It's definitely a possibility. So we're not making claims with certainty. We're just saying this is the argument for thinking this is what's right, and you can make psychological arguments about the fallibility of human minds, saying that you probably or you have a very good chance of being wrong. And of course, that's true about everything. But even then, I think Cohen would say, from where we stand, given the way we've been conditioned morally, given the moral intuitions that we have, even from where we stand, we see that from this vantage point, over there is better. And it might be that once we get over there, we recognize that isn't actually the best place. We think it's the best spot, but there's other better spots. So a metaphor for this might be something like we're out looking for a picnic, and we're standing in a particular spot, and we look up on a hill, and we see that spot on the hill from where we can stand is clearly better than where we are right now. Now, we might conclude that's the best possible spot on the hill that you can ever be. And if we actually got to that spot on the hill, we might realize, one thing might happen is we might realize that there's even better spots. There's higher places to be than where we are right now.
That you can only see from that picnic spot.
Yeah. And the other thing that could happen is you get to that spot on the top of the hill, and unbeknownst to you, it's poisonous and you all die, and you just couldn't see that from where you are. That's a possibility that what looks to be the best spot won't turn out to be. But given where you are right now, Cohen would say you're justified in thinking that's at least better, and you're probably justified in thinking it's best. But of course, you should be self-skeptical and recognize you could be mistaken about all those things.
Well, that's interesting because I guess one of the things that's unclear to me about a certain kind of ideal theorizing is it really is just kind of what kind of claim is being made. So it if I feel like there's a lot of kind of implicit meta ethics that determines how you think about these things. So if you have a kind of sort of intuitionist moral realism, then I think it can make you might think that thought experiments about wouldn't this be a nice way to live could have some sort of authority, that your intuitions might, reliably track facts about moral reality. If you don't have that kind of view, which I don't, and think that people's moral sensibilities are just really super contingent, and have a hard time articulating exactly how an idea of moral truths or moral facts, what's different about those from natural facts and empirical facts. Like if you have a kind of skeptical sentimentalist view of morality, it's hard. It's just harder to understand what you're doing when you're making judgments about idealized cases.
Yeah, that's right. And Cohen has a book called Rescuing Justice and Equality, and it's all a response to that kind of meta ethics and why he thinks it's mistaken, and it's in favor of an intuitionist moral realism. He the book's 600 pages long.
You should summarize it in the next 30 seconds.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think the kinds of arguments that I've made so far are the kinds of things he says. He just says them longer and better, and he has internal critiques of the various things that people say. So here's an argument from Rawls, and here's a flaw in it that you should recognize as a flaw regardless of your meta ethics. But at the end of the day, he just wants to say, no, what was right and wrong just does not depend on what people want to do. And once you get from can't doesn't imply can't, it doesn't imply that you not ought. He thinks everything else follows from that. I mean, we can still have debates about this principle versus that principle. Is equality required and why? And is social justice required and why? And what does it mean to respect one another? He thinks we can still have these kinds of debates in the abstract, but he just doesn't accept that human nature the human nature in the sense of our motivations imposes any limits on what is required from us.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about that aspect of Cohen, as a Marxist and as a socialist, is that like actual Marx has perhaps the most radical view of the endogeneity of the moral sense to institutional structure, right?
Yeah.
That we can't even think thoughts that are unconditioned in some way by the disposition of the means of production. It's a crazy hypothesis, but that's real Marxist materialism. And so within, and we're not the best people to be talking about debates within Marxism, probably, but like within Marxist circles, Cohen has done a fairly radical thing. He's actually rejecting the whole Marxist tradition of the way social and economic structure conditions our minds in order to find a way to really grip onto the sort of Marxist ideal in a kind of bulletproof way. He kind of sees that if you take on all of that sort of endogeneity and contingency, that there's not actually a way to say decisively that this is the best way for people to live.
Right. Yeah, it is a surprising reversal. Marx would brand himself as a social scientist. Utopian socialists, they're doing moral philosophy. I, Marx, am a scientist. Yeah. I am telling you how the world works and what is going to happen and why it will happen, in not like explaining the world. And then Cohen pretty much, he actually says in one of his books, I can see that bourgeois economics is basically sound. And by bourgeois economics, he means what I call just economics.
Economics, yeah.
Like not socialist economics. And by socialist economics, what we mean, what I think of that is like what they do in English departments, not what they do in econ departments, right? So he
it's not pretty. As someone in an English graduate program, it's pretty frustrating.
So he like basically concedes that the markets work the way that econ textbooks say that they work. He doesn't accept all of that. He thinks that there's much more market failure than say I do. He thinks, but despite that, like he basically accepts that the world doesn't work the way that Marx says it does. However, Marx's moral critique of capitalism is awesome, which is funny because Marx doesn't think of himself as making a moral critique of capitalism. He thinks of himself as making having a scientific account of what's going to happen and why it will fall apart.
Marx's conception of exploitation, say, Marx doesn't present as being loaded with value judgments. He just thinks that there's a fact of the matter about surplus value being expropriated, and that's what the definition of exploitation is when that's right. There's something like an objective value of labor, and people aren't getting paid it, and so I'll call that exploitation. He could have called it, he could have made up a word for it. He uses a moralized word, but he could have used a non-moral word. He could have just called it, reduced payment or something like that. So it is a radical departure from Marx, and he does accept some parts of Marxist theories about social change in history, but for the most part, Cohen is taking Marx as having a powerful moral critique, which I think is the right thing to do, isn't it? I mean, Marx resonates today with people because of the moral stuff, not because of the social scientific stuff. Like, if you take introductory microeconomics and macroeconomics and pay attention, you're not going to come out of that thinking that Marxist economics is right. It's just the evidence that it's wrong is just overwhelming. It's like not. I mean, I'll put my cards on the table because I don't think anyone can deny this. It's not intellectually respectable to be an empirical Marxist. If you think that's like being a creationist, it's just something that like left wing people do rather than right wing people do. Cohen, to his credit, recognizes that that's the case, and he uses the moral stuff, and that's the thing that's stuck around is the moral critique. Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to charitably think of what empirical aspects are empirically credible. I think the stuff that has the greatest sort of pull descriptively is kind of understanding how individuals in a labor market are overpowered by capitalists. And so just sort of descriptively, the argument for why you need a labor union, why you need to have collective bargaining against capitalist management. like I think there's some actually like persuasive like game theoretical reasons why individuals in labor markets are going to be in a poor negotiating position. And might,
I don't mean to say that everything he said was wrong.
Yeah.
Though even that stuff, it's like other people said it first instead of
better. That's what I'm saying. But because when you think of people who are who describe themselves as Marxists, a lot of times, I mean, mostly what they have in mind. I mean, there's a young man who's been arguing for full communism recently. What's his name? I forgot.
I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think there's a generational thing where people who came up after the collapse of the communist regimes didn't really experience the sense of sort of liberal capitalism having won this historical contest, whereas people our age, I'm a bit older than you, but you remember the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union, and I think that has a kind of salience. I think in the earlier, and so there's this whole. This is a digression, but kind of interesting to me about why there's a kind of millennial resurgence of a kind of socialist idea. So there are these magazines, the Jacobin and the New Inquiry, where there are a lot of progressives and people who come out of the sort of Occupy Wall Street was a formative event for a lot of younger people, and they seem to be moved by a lot of these moral arguments for socialism, but the kind of empirical arguments really haven't gotten a lot better.
Yeah, that's right. That makes sense. Yeah, I feel like
that was an observation.
Yeah, that's right. I feel like I should invoke that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it type claim, but we'll see what happens. But yeah, you're right. It is interesting that people kind of ignore. Every semester, I find students who will basically come up with central command economy and say, what we just need is a board of nice people to sort of have all this stuff and then just distribute it the right way and then tell people what to do to make more of it. Hasn't anyone ever thought of this before? Isn't it obvious? It's yeah, they're actually, believe it or not, you're not the first person to think that. Believe it or not, things have happened before 1980.
So rhetorically, as and it's not unimportant by any means. Even if I'm skeptical about the decisiveness of ideal theorizing. I'm not sure what is being discovered, but I see that ideal theory has very strong rhetorical and persuasive power. And what's one of the reasons I'm interested in writing fiction, that when you present a set of circumstances that may not be real, it can be incredibly emotionally moving. You're latching into people's moral sensibilities in a certain way. And I think what tends to happen to people is when you're young, 18, 19, early undergraduate years, you kind of attach, like a little baby duckling to whoever, whatever it thinks its mother is, right? You kind of attach to an ideal theory. And then your intellectual development is as a kind of progressive disillusionment, where you start to see that all of the compliance problems involved. You start to see, which ways in which human nature is too complicated or too, corrupt or whatever, too imperfect to realize that. But still, that's that ideal theory that you start with. You sort of progressively drop off from it, and your kind of final middle-aged politics still are heavily influenced by it. So, I got, entranced by Ayn Rand when I was 19, and I'm a long way off on Ayn Rand, but my politics now are not what they would be if I'd fixed on Marx instead at 19. It's because that opens up a whole avenue of a whole tradition of inquiry that you become sympathetic to. And I've, taken on lots of different and better arguments for why I like capitalism and markets and rights and things like that. But still, it affects you, and so I think it's important that to say, like, here is an ideal picture of, and that is in fact what Ayn Rand was doing. She was doing capitalist ideal theory. It was weird, but you see that has had a huge cultural effect, because ideal theories are powerful.
That's right. It's funny you said that, because when I was thinking about this, I had an earlier paper published on responding to Cohen, and I said what he really needs to think about is like a Galt's Gulch from Atlas Shrugged, but without Randians. Because the problem with Ayn Rand is, like, she recognized, she's like, we need to have a moral argument for capitalism, not simply economic arguments, not simply consequentialist arguments that it works better and produces more of what people want. We need a moral argument. But then she kind of thinks, well, if you think that morality involves being kind to people and holding that other people other than yourself have value, and that it's important that institutions tend to work a certain way such that everyone can flourish under them, and that's part of what legitimates institutions, not just a nice side effect, but it legitimates them. She thinks if you think that, you're going to be socialist. So what does she do? She does what I would call dumbing down morality. Well, morality is about egoism, and even though she has an esoteric view of what selfishness is, at the end of the day, she is still really a kind of egoist. So her ideal theory is, I think, conceding a lot of morality to Cohen, but she just says it's not really morality. What Cohen calls morality is this evil version, or like I'm not sure what word I'm looking for, but kind of a corrupted idea of what morality is.
The more I think about it, the more I think the more Ayn Rand is actually like a weird parallel to Cohen in which she's so. I mean, she was a Russian who lived through the revolution, whose family was sort of whose property was expropriated. Escapes from Soviet Russia. They lived around the corner from the Nabokovs. I always thought that was interesting. Such different writers. And she so clearly thinks that that any hint of altruism leads to socialism. That she wants to deny, like in the most unsympathetic way. So she paints a portrait of altruistic morality that is a lot like Cohen's idea of what capitalism has to be.
Right. Cohen likes to build into the very. He knows better intellectually, but he often just treats it as almost analytic to the definition of capitalism that is motivated by fear and greed, and that a system that's not. I mean, this is actually a real confusion for him, and I'm not the first person to point this out. It's that he sometimes seems to treat socialism, which is by definition just a particular way of distributing control rights over the means of production, with community and kindness and friendship and love. So he almost identifies socialism with values, and then identifies capitalism with other attitudes that are not good, evil, angry attitudes. And it's not a good move. If I say in the book, like, if I were to criticize socialism by saying, socialism is by definition a system of bloodthirsty dictators who murder peasants, and if there's kindness and caring, it's not socialism. Everyone would think that's bogus, but Cohen kind of gets away with doing that with capitalism. Well, capitalism is by definition a system in which people are preying upon one another and are kind of callous and indifferent to one another.
That's an important point. I mean, it's an important point that at bottom, and that's partly what I think you're trying to help us see. Jason, are you there? You seem to have frozen up on me.
Yeah, that's right. I saw you sort of disappeared for a second.
You're there. You're there. At bottom, this is a debate about the collective versus individual ownership of property.
Yeah.
And it really is this very. I mean, it's just like, how are we going to organize who has control rights over things?
Right.
And that really is in itself morally neutral. And that as soon as you start to smuggle in that, this way of having control rights is about fear and greed, or this way is about like you're doing, and I think that's very true. It's about the way ideologues tend to argue, is that there's when they talk about something like property regimes, they load it up with lots of emotional freight.
Right.
And so when socialists talk about socialism, they mean caring. Or a lot of times when socialists who know that socialism is a sort of bugbear word in American discourse, they'll just decide to use democracy to mean socialism.
That's right, yeah.
And then their idea of democracy is full of puppy dogs and, baskets of flowers. But, democracy is all, that's just a different kind of, it's a mechanism for, collective choice, for making decisions about public affairs. It's not, it doesn't have any ideals built into it.
Yeah, that's right. That's how I want to treat it too. It's like the difference between capitalism and socialism is by definition just about who controls what. And then it's an open question, like given a set of values and given a set of constraints, like about how human beings are and given what we want to achieve, which one of these is better and why. We just treat it as these are choices we can pick from. We don't want to load up the word such that it becomes by definition good to be socialist or by definition good to be capitalist.
Before we run out of time, I want you to we need to come back around to your argument. So the sort of concluding aspect of your argument is that even if we're morally perfect in all the ways that Cohen would like us to be, we are still going to want private property in markets. And you argue that there are virtues of private property in markets that even fully benevolent, fully empathetic, fully cooperative people would want. And I'd like you to elucidate those a little bit.
Yeah. Since we're long on time, I'm going to be relatively quick about it. But what I basically say is the standard textbook economic arguments are going to be out because we're not going to talk about avoiding tragic commons or avoiding free riding. They have to be other kinds of things. And if we're talking about morally perfect people, the kinds of things that would make private property valuable to them are going to be largely aesthetic rather than necessary. So what I would point out is that human beings, and this is not a morally bad feature of them, it's a feature that we should be glad exists and even celebrate, are diverse. We have diverse ends that we want to pursue. We don't all want to be doing the same thing. We want, and part of what it gives meaning to our lives is to have sustained projects over time. And in order, I argue in the book, instrumentally, in order to have sustained projects over time, we need to be able to count on having things that are exclusively within our control. Things we might be willing to give up to help one another, but things we can count on being left a certain way and used a certain way, and that others will not just take for their own ends. And so for this reason, I argue that people are going to want Minnie to have her bow factory. And then people might say, the average leftist person recognizes that's going to be true about guitars and about computers and things like that. And they say,
no one's against people having their own toothbrushes.
Right. But why factories? And I say, I think a lot of what's going on here is a parochialism of political philosophy. It's that philosophers are usually people who have no experience in business and spend in school their entire lives. And it's very interesting that it turns out the things that Rawls thinks are basic liberties are exactly the things that would be really useful to Rawls, right? So I think I say to them, like, if you can understand why an artist would want to paint a painting by himself with his own paintbrush rather than doing the painting collectively and having the decisions about how it's painted to be done collectively by committee, even an ideally situated committee, an ideally motivated committee, he just still would want to do it by himself. And that's not a bad thing about him. If you could see that, or if you could see why someone might want to write a philosophy paper by himself rather than having a co-authored or being written by committee and having the decisions being made collectively through deliberation, if you can understand that, then you can understand why a person, not you maybe, but a different person like Minnie Mouse or Clarabelle Cow might want to have their own factories where they run things according to their own vision. Or Willie the Giant might want to have his own farm where he runs things according to his own vision. It gives him a greater possibility of leading the life he wants to lead. And furthermore, so there's a number of arguments like this about why we'd want private property. And then as far as trade, I think of it this way: it's we want trade on a massive scale. We want markets on a massive scale for informational reasons. Cohen concedes that there's no way to have cooperation on a scale of billions without a market. That markets have informational properties built into prices, and there's no substitute for that. So I basically say, like someone like Mickey Mouse, knowing that this is how markets work, and then wanting, because he's so benevolent and altruistic, wanting to make other people flourish, would want to have a market system so that they can have massive amounts of production, so that everyone has more positive liberty and a greater chance of realizing their conception of the good life. And so I go through an argument for basically they see markets as a magic wand that makes people richer, and being benevolent, they want to wave the magic wand. And Cohen has to accept that because he's conceding bourgeois economics. Finally, the final thing I just take from Nozick, and this is, I think, really kind of funny, it's that Nozick in the end of Anarchy, State, and Utopia has this line about, well, libertarianism is a framework for utopia. And the thing that's cool about it is it allows you to have different types of utopia. So what I say in the book is, well, which would you choose? Would you rather live in the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse world, maybe with real people, or would you rather live in Cohen's camping trip? And then I say, it's a trick question because the thing about the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse world is it doesn't make you choose. They're totally fine with the Smurfs coming in and having a little commune in the middle of it, as long as the Smurfs aren't going to force everyone to be communist, as long as they're not going to be pushy about it, right?
Yeah.
So you
Papa
can
Smurf has totalitarian designs.
I know. If that's the case, he's not good enough to be in that world,
Yeah.
but as long as he's kind of a tolerant socialist, fine. Have a kibbutz over here. Have a commune over here. I'm a communist. I live in a commune. Like, my house is a commune. It's just, I'm communist with my family and not communist with the rest of the world. So it's fine to have these little communes here and there, and then you have a framework, an overall framework that is capitalistic and free. And the reason that's great is because it allows people to have different kinds of utopias. Since everybody is a little bit different, since we don't all care about the same things and have the same ends and desires and same psychology, what counts as the best possible society is going to be different from each of us. And Nozick in Anarchy, State, and Utopia argues that a libertarian framework under ideal conditions will allow all of these different kinds of utopias to flourish, and that's why it's sort of the meta-utopia. So I think this is really funny because Cohen's first really big book, he had a book that was pretty popular, but his first really big book was a critique of Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And my take on this is that what Cohen has done is shown us inadvertently that Nozick was right about utopia. That the actual effect of Cohen's life's work, with a little bit of help from me, is to vindicate Robert Nozick.
That would be ironic.
Yeah, sorry.
One question I have about the meta-utopia sort of idea, I find that the most sort of congenial sort of argument because I tend to be skeptical about ideal theorizing, since I don't feel like I know what people would be like if we were better, because I don't really know how to idealize how we are or what makes sense to idealize. Like, I don't know. I don't have a theory of constrained idealization that allows me to idealize people along certain moral dimensions, but doesn't allow me to idealize them along certain cognitive dimensions. I don't know why people get to be omnibenevolent but not omniscient, and so on. So I don't really understand. I can't really conceive of what I think people would be like, but I can conceive of that there is going to be this sort of intractable plurality, and that however it turns out, you want to have a framework that accommodates this plurality in conceptions of utopia, and it needs to be one in which various utopias can peaceably coexist. And I guess that takes for granted that like some version of a society ruled by Sharia law isn't the actual true utopia. So there's some sort of liberal assumptions that are being projected, but it allows you to actually remain indifferent between socialism and capitalism, right? You can say that maybe socialism is the best way to live, but only within a larger framework that permits capitalism to exist.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a sense in which, this is just borrowing from Nozick again. There's an asymmetry in capitalism and socialism, in that capitalism is always and everywhere okay with socialism. You're always allowed to have communal property, and you can see that because everyone watching this has communal property probably. They're all communists at home, at least to some degree. And socialism is sort of by definition, it's exclusive. It's the system under which the means of production are owned collectively. So if you have private ownership, it's no longer socialist. I mean, obviously it's not rigoristic, like as soon as you have one instance of private property, it stops being socialist and becomes completely capitalist. There's a continuum, but you can see how it's kind of built into that definition that you have this exclusion. So capitalism isn't like that. Capitalism allows for communes. I mean, it allows for these things to flourish. It allows for worker cooperatives. It allows for anything you want to, however you want to own it. It's an option on the table. So why, if you thought that human diversity was a bad thing, if you thought that pluralism was a bad thing, if you thought no, the only way you can be is the kind of person who wants to live in the socialist camping trip. If that's not your personal favorite view of utopia, you're a horrible person. Well, then Cohen, I guess, wins. But I don't think he has any moral reason to say that, because he has real complaints about real markets. There are lots of features about real markets that are genuinely terrible. And there is genuine market failure. There's genuine depravity. There's genuine exploitation. There are libertarians who deny that. I think they're crazy. Those things exist and they are bad. The thing is, the way he wants us to do moral philosophy is one where we imagine away the motives that lead to those kinds of things in socialism, but they also get rid of those things in capitalism. So now we're just looking at a slate of really attractive options, and the capitalist utopia says, pick one, whatever you want, it's fine. You have not everything's in, but lots of things are in, and you can pick the one that's best for you. So, I say in the real world, capitalism encourages entrepreneurs to give you things that you want at prices you can afford to pay. And under ideal conditions, it does even better because it gives you the possibility of living your personal utopia.
All right. Well, I think our time is up, so I will recommend to people as part of their personal projects picking up Why Not Capitalism by Jason Brennan. And if you're a socialist, why not capitalism? Give it a try. Give it a try. Maybe you'll be convinced. Thanks so much, Jason.
Yeah, thank you very much. Have a good one.
Take care.